AMD is launching the 9070 GRE to the global market. It's been available in the China region for around a year. It's a 12 gigabyte product with a cut down compute unit and memory bandwidth compared to the other 9070 cards, which also are 16 gigabyte versus the 12 on the GRE. Now, AMD wants to heavily market this as an alternative to NVIDIA's 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte version, and to be fair, that is its closest price competitor, going by the 9070 GRE's promised MSRP of $550, which for the sake of a day one review, I have to just kind of say that's what they say it'll cost, and we'll have to see how it plays out in the actual market. Now, the problem, though, isn't the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. It does do well in that matchup. I have it averaging 19% faster than the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte in my testing, with the worst result for the 9070 GRE just being in a path tracing test in Cyberpunk 2077, where the 5060 Ti really wasn't getting a high enough frame rate where I would really recommend using those settings anyway. No, the problem for the 9070 GRE is if you compare it against NVIDIA's RTX 5070, which, like the GRE, has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, although it does cost a bit more than the 9070 GRE. In this matchup, the GRE gets a few wins, but they're very rare, and on average, the 5070 is definitely faster, although it costs more. Here's how it breaks down as a percentage difference in all of the tests that I ran here. My tests are all focusing on either games, big games from 2026 or some of the biggest games from 2025. So I test the latest games and I test a variety of graphics settings at 1440p, both native and with upscaling. I always do the maximum preset, native and with upscaling, and I do the like a setting or two down on the presets, native and with upscaling in most of the tests here. That's kind of what you're looking at. On average, I had the 5070 5% faster using the GeoMean. It had a outlier result of path tracing that was a 43% lead, and actually the 5070 was fast enough there where it was usable with balanced upscaling on the RT Overdrive preset in Cyberpunk 2077. It was averaging about 60 FPS in the built-in benchmark. Now, there's some areas of the game that are a little more demanding than the built-in benchmark, but it was a usable setting. Now, AMD generally does well in Call of Duty, and that's where I saw the GRE get its biggest leads at 10 and 11%. In various settings in that game. Now, again, in the actual market, the pricing on these competitors does have the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte as the closer price competitor, coming in at $570 for its lower price models, and then it goes up from there. And again, the GRE is meant to be $550, and the RTX 5070 is coming in at about $600 for its lowest price models, and more commonly is available closer to $630. I'll be honest, I'd been seeing it coming in at $630 for a long time, and these $600 priced options seem to have shown up right as they were promising this launch. So was this actually a direct, pricing correction or specifically targeted at the GRE? That's a question. So we might look at like $600 or $630 and kind of analyze both of those options from a value perspective here. So let's take a look at how this breaks down in kind of the average differences. So if we look at this up against the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, which is its closest price competitor, we're seeing that the GRE is priced at 96% of the price. It's 19% faster, so if you then divide the performance ratio by the price ratio, you get the price to performance ratio. And basically, we see that the GRE is offering about 23% better performance per dollar than the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, although it does have less VRAM, but it has more performance and a slightly lower price. When looking at it against the RTX 5070, we'll take two different pricings into account. The most common price I've seen on the lowest models for the 5070 recently has been $630, and if I look at it that way, then $550 compared to $630 means that the GRE is priced at about 87% of the price of a 5070, and if I look at the performance ratio, it reaches about 95% of the performance on average, which means if we divide those, we see that the GRE offers about 9% better performance per dollar as a value ratio. Now, we could also look at it based on the current lowest pricing I'm seeing right now, which does have some 5070s at $600. Like I said, that's not typical. I've been, over the last few months, monitoring pricing ever since everything went way up with when RAM pricing went up. And 630 has been much more common. But today, which is on May 30th, I'm filming this, and this video can go live on June 1st, I believe is when you'll see it. So there's a couple of days in between, so maybe something changes in the meantime, but I am seeing some $600 available. So if we look at it that way, 550 out of 600 is about 92% of the price. And then, like I said, it reaches about 95% of the performance. So if we divide the performance per dollar, get that ratio, that's about 4% better performance per dollar. Now, while it is better, either by 4% or 9%, depending on which price number you take into account for the 5070, and all of this is assuming that the 9070 GRE actually hits its $550 price point, that basically means, also here, they're both 12 gigabyte cards, so that's not really advantage either way, although NVIDIA does tend to be slightly more efficient with its VRAM usage, so there could be edge cases where that helps it out. But anyway, it's not a huge performance per dollar advantage for the 9070 GRE against the 5070, and that's a downside because NVIDIA has the mind share leadership, the market share leadership, and quite frankly does have a better feature set. DLSS is better than FSR, even if FSR has been coming a long way. More games have DLSS support. NVIDIA's frame generation situation has better frame pacing and supports bigger multiples. Like the actual image quality of the DLSS upscaling against FSR upscaling is still a little bit of an edge for DLSS, even if FSR 4.1 has come a long way. So for all of those reasons, I would easily pay an extra 9% to get an otherwise equivalent, same VRAM, slightly more performance. You get the idea, right? So in general, once AMD can hit a 20 to 30% performance per dollar advantage, I start to lean in the direction of the AMD GPU, especially if they offer like more VRAM or something like that. But when they're this close, I can't really recommend, saving a tiny bit of money to get the 9070 GRE instead of a 5070, when the 5070 on average is faster and with a better feature set and has the same amount of VRAM. And if you're really going to compare it, NVIDIA tends to be a little more efficient on its VRAM compression, or however it's taking advantage of it when I look at them tested side by side. So that's really most of my thoughts here when it comes down to the 9070 GRE. It does provide a significantly better performance per dollar compared to the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, but that's like the worst performance per dollar card in NVIDIA's lineup in this price point, and the 5070 just makes a lot more sense anyway when comparing the two. So that's the problem, is I would just buy the 5070 instead. Now, I also prepared some side-by-side footage if you want to see how all of these tests actually played out. So one thing you'll notice is I also have some tests that aren't even on these bar graphs, because there are some games that, I don't like this by the way, but it is what it is. There are some games that have launched this year, big games, with path tracing modes that just don't let you enable them on AMD GPUs. That's what you're seeing here. So path tracing in Resident Evil Requiem 1440p max plus path tracing with DLSS balance. The 5070 is kind of usable at 51 FPS. It's also pushing up against its 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer. Some people might play this way. Some people might prefer not to. In a single player game, I could see, this being considered somewhat usable to some people, even if a lot of people would chase a higher frame rate. And again, just not an option that you get on the 9070 GRE. If we go to the otherwise maxed out settings with 1440p max plus RT high rather than path tracing at native resolution, the 9070 GRE and the 5070 are basically tied at 50 and 49 FPS, with the 5060 Ti at 44. The 12 gigabyte cards seem to be struggling here compared to the card with 16. So this does seem to be a situation where you're going over 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and I think that's why the two 12 gigabyte cards basically tie, is because they're both having to slow down and access system memory. In 1440p max settings, RT high, so the same ones we were just at, but enabling DLSS and FSR4 at the balanced settings, We now see the 5070 taking the lead at 95 FPS, the GRE at 87, and the 5060 Ti 16GB at 75. So starting to hit more of what you would expect kind of from their relative performance differentials. All of them giving you a good experience here, but again, the 5070 is giving the best result. Now, if you want to play at the normal settings, which also with RT turned off, but at native resolution, all these GPUs are doing a good job. 84 FPS on the 5060 Ti 16GB, but the GRE is 27% faster at 107, and the 5070 is only a little bit ahead, basically tied, but a little bit ahead with the GRE at 109 FPS. So again, up against the 5060 Ti, the GRE is looking pretty good here, but compared with the 5070, it's like, eh. Now, if we switch over to Pragmata, another big release from this year, this is another game that offers a path tracing mode for NVIDIA users and doesn't allow you to enable it for anybody else, which again is a game practice that I don't support. I don't like that this is the case, but it is the case, and the 5070 actually averages 59 FPS in my test, although the more open areas, like you're seeing right here, can average into the lower 50s, it's pretty usable for a single player experience if you choose to go that route for maximum visual quality. Also, the path tracing does look significantly better than the ray tracing in this game. Now, if we do turn off path tracing and just look at ray tracing at native resolution at 1440p, we're seeing the 5060 Ti hit 77 FPS, the GRE is 30% faster at 100, and the 5070 is basically tied but technically winning at 101 FPS. So again, another situation where the GRE is looking pretty great against the 5060 Ti, but the 5070 pulls a little bit ahead and offers more supported features in the game. If we kick on balanced level upscaling on that same preset, with DLSS and FSR4 is supported here, and FSR4 is looking really good in the side-by-sides. It holds up very well. We see the GRE 23% ahead of the 5060 Ti at 129 FPS versus 105, but the 5070 is in the lead at 132. Again, not a mind-blowing difference over the GRE, but it is winning. It does cost a little bit more, though. Now, if we look at the balanced preset at native resolution, balanced is the name of the graphics preset in the game. It's not using upscaling. And this also turns ray tracing off. We now see the GRE at 114 FPS, putting it 25% ahead of the 5060 Ti 16GB, which is hitting 91 FPS. The 5070 is in the lead at 118 FPS. So again, 4 FPS lead over the 9070 GRE. It's not a ton, but it is winning. We could also kick on balanced level upscaling with DLSS and FSR4 on that same balanced preset. And now we're seeing 118 FPS on the 5060 Ti. The GRE is hitting 148 FPS, putting it 25% ahead of the 5060 Ti. And actually now it is 2 FPS ahead of the 5070, which is hitting 146. So, the upscaling, the FSR and the DLSS, they don't always have exactly the same, even performance hit comparative to each other. So sometimes you can see the lead swing a bit when you're upscaling, which is one reason why I test it, because a lot of people do use upscaling when playing the game. A path tracing test that actually will allow you to enable it on AMD GPUs is Cyberpunk 2077, where the GRE hits 42 FPS, which only leaves it at 89% of the 5060 Ti, which is hitting 47. And the 5070 is actually very usable here at 60 FPS. Also, the image quality looks way better on the NVIDIA GPUs because they have ray reconstruction in this game, which is AMD's ray regeneration is not supported there in Cyberpunk. One of the biggest releases of the year is Forza Horizon 6 at its maximum settings at native resolution, Extreme plus RT. The GRE is 9% ahead of the 5060 Ti at 48 versus 44, and the 5070 is at 52, putting it in the lead here. So we're seeing all of the GPUs a little more compressed against each other, and there's some signs that we might be up against a 12 gigabyte VRAM barrier, but it's really, really borderline. If we kick on DLSS and FSR4 at the balanced settings, but otherwise sticking to the Extreme plus RT maximum preset, we see all the GPUs a lot more performant now, 74 FPS on the GRE, putting it 9% ahead of the 5060 Ti, but the 5070 is hitting 81 FPS. So it is definitely noticeably faster in this test, although all of them are very, very usable here. Again, all of these GPUs, by the way, I think are very usable on a 1440p monitor, whichever one you get. You can see that they are doing well, all of them in all of the latest games. But it's, again, trying to hunt down, so which one are you going to buy if they all have a pretty similar price? 1440p Extreme without any ray tracing, but at the native resolution, is 93 FPS on the GRE, which puts it 18% ahead of the 5060 Ti and actually exactly matches the performance of the 5070 in this test, both of those hitting 93. So evenly matched there when we turned off the ray tracing. So looks like the RT in this game may have been a little more NVIDIA favored compared to AMD, since when we turned it off, the GRE kind of pulled ahead relative to the NVIDIA GPUs. Kicking on FSR4 and DLSS4 at the balanced preset gets the GRE up to 110 FPS, putting it 11% faster than the 5060 Ti, which is at 99, and the 5070 is coming in at 113. So again, pretty close to the GRE, but a little bit ahead. Again, all of them getting very, very high frame rates here, so good experience on all of them for sure. In Crimson Desert, the maximum settings, even using DLSS and FSR4 at the balance setting, when you turn on ray reconstruction or ray regeneration in this game, it turns on like a hidden upgraded ray tracing setting, which is very demanding. And in combination with the otherwise maxed out cinematic preset at 1440p, none of the GPUs do really well here. It's 39 versus 34, putting 15% lead for the GRE against the 5060 Ti, but the 5070 is furthest in the lead at 44. If we just go to the native resolution at the Ultra preset, which, by the way, does still include some ray tracing, it's just not that hidden extra heavy ray tracing setting. Now we're seeing 65 FPS on the GRE, which puts it 16% ahead of the 5060 Ti, which is getting 56, but the 5070 takes a bigger lead at 73 FPS. This is one of the games that give a little bit more of a lead to NVIDIA relative to AMD compared to a lot of the other games that we're testing. And that's just how it is, game by game, engine by engine. Sometimes one GPU vendor or the other kind of outperforms compared to the average results. At DLSS and FSR4 balanced on the Ultra preset, we're seeing 86 FPS on the GRE, putting it 23% ahead of the 70 FPS that I'm seeing on the 5060 Ti 16GB, and the 5070 is furthest in the lead at 90 frames per second. So again, not like a huge advantage for the 5070, but it definitely is the one taking the lead here in this game. Now looking at Call of Duty Black Ops 7 at 1440p native resolution, but the preset name is balanced, we're seeing 198 FPS on the GRE, putting it 38% ahead of the 5060 Ti, and it's also noticeably ahead of the 5070 here, which is hitting 178 FPS. This is pretty normal for Call of Duty. Call of Duty tends to overperform on AMD relative to NVIDIA, compared to like the average result you typically see across a wide variety of games. But it's a game played by a lot of people, so it makes sense to show the results here. DLSS and FSR4 balanced on the balanced preset, push it up to 217 FPS on the GRE, putting it 35% ahead of the 5060 Ti, which is at 161 FPS, and the 5070 is hitting 193 FPS. So again, you can hit high frame rates on all of these GPUs, but the AMD GPU does have a standout performance in this particular game. So if this is one you play a lot, you might factor that into your decision making. Battlefield 6, on the other hand, does seem to be a good showing for the 5070 relative to the GRE. The GRE is hitting 84 FPS. The 5060 Ti has a nice result at 69, but the GRE is 22% ahead, and the 5070 hits 92 frames per second. So again, 92 versus 84. It's not a mind-blowing difference, but it is one of the larger leads we've seen for the 5070. And again, just if you're playing Battlefield 6 most of the time, you might take that into account, If we kick on the balanced level upscaling for DLSS and FSR on the Overkill preset here, the 9070 GRE hits 115 FPS, putting it 17% ahead of the 5060 Ti 16GB, and the 5070, on the other hand, reaches 129 FPS. So again, pretty good lead here for the 5070, at least relative to what we've been seeing in most of the games. One of the more noticeable advantages. At 1440p medium settings, things kind of contract a little bit. And we see the GRE at 140 versus 110 on the 5060 Ti, giving it a 27% lead. And the 5070 hits 145 FPS, so it is still beating the GRE, but not by as wide of a percentage differential as we saw at the overkill settings. By the way, this is another reason why I like to test out more than one graphics preset in games, because a lot of times people don't play at the maximum preset, and I've noticed in a lot of games, different presets actually scale differently between GPUs and GPU vendors. So that's one reason why I like to test that. Again, same thing with upscaling. So looking at that here on the medium preset with DLSS, and I forgot to mention it, but FSR balanced. I didn't type the FSR out there, whatever. 177 FPS versus 5060 Ti hitting 144, so 23% lead for the GRE. And the 5070 hits 185 FPS. So in Battlefield 6, it does seem like the NVIDIA GPUs take a bit more of a lead than they do in some other games. Thought I'd test out another popular and fairly recent, so could be a little more graphically demanding, multiplayer title with Marvel Rivals. At 1440p ultra settings, we see 68 FPS on the GRE versus 55 on the 5060 Ti, 24% lead for the GRE, and the 5070 hits 71 FPS. So not a huge lead over the GRE, but it is technically winning. Now, I didn't test out upscaling in this game head-to-head here. I actually did test it, but when looking at my footage, I realized I think I had accidentally enabled FSR 3 rather than FSR 4 on my GRE, and I didn't have time to retest it in time to get this video out as a day one review. So I took out the upscaling results on this particular head-to-head because FSR 3 does perform differently than FSR 4, and I didn't want to have that mess up the results. 1440p medium settings was 105 FPS versus 87 on the 5060 Ti, giving the GRE a 21% advantage, and the 5070 hit 118 frames per second, which is noticeably faster than the GRE. In last year's Game of the Year, at 1440p epic settings, none of the GPUs are doing a great job at native resolution. The GRE hitting 46 FPS, putting it 24% faster than the 37 FPS on the 5060 Ti 16GB, and the 5070 hits 48, so 2 FPS faster than the GRE. Not a mind-blowing lead or anything like that, but I also don't think I would be using these settings since all of them are reaching fairly low frame rates. Using DLSS and FSR 4 at the balanced preset, and I'm glad this game does have FSR 4 now. At launch, there was no FSR of any kind supported in the game, although it did have XCSS, if I remember correctly. Anyway, DLSS FSR 4 balance, we're seeing 76 FPS versus 5060 Ti at 64, so 19% lead for the GRE, 5070 at 78, and all of them are now well comfortably over 60 FPS, and this would be a very reasonable way to actually play the game on these GPUs. Now, if you prefer to play at native resolution, the medium preset gets very similar performance to what we saw from the epic preset with balanced upscaling. We're seeing 65, 77, and 82 FPS respectively. The GRE is getting 18% lead over the 5060 Ti, and the 5070 again at 82 FPS compared to 77 FPS on the GRE. Not a mind-blowing lead, but it is definitely a lead. And if you really want a high refresh rate experience, you could play at the medium preset and use balanced level upscaling. Again, DLSS and FSR 4 supported here. And we're seeing 113 FPS from the GRE, which is 12% faster than the 5060 Ti at 101, and the 5070 is hitting 119. I did notice that all of the results kind of compressed in here a little bit, so it's possible we're starting to see somewhat of a system limitation or something like that kind of mix into it there. So again, you can look at the side-by-sides of all of the results and everything and make the comparisons, but I really kind of led the video with the final conclusion. The final conclusion is that the 9070 GRE is noticeably faster and provides significantly better value than its closest priced NVIDIA competitor, which is the 5060 Ti 16GB. It's on average 19% faster and costs slightly less, although basically the same price. That is, if the promised MSRP is what we end up seeing on the actual market. But the elephant in the room is that the 5070 doesn't cost all that much more once you're already spending this kind of money. And in that matchup, the GRE just, averages slower. The 5070 is averaging 5% faster in my testing, but many of the results are closer to 10% faster. And in feature sets like path tracing, the 5070 isn't great for path tracing, but it's also not unusable. And in those situations, it gets significantly better results. And just in general, the NVIDIA feature set is just noticeably better in most cases. And so with that being said, on the actual market, if I could spend a little bit more and get a 5070 instead of the 9070 GRE, I do think it would be worth it to do so. But if my absolute maximum budget did hold me to cards like the the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte from NVIDIA versus the 9070 GRE. So in other words, if you had to choose between these two that are at the closest match in price, the 9070 GRE is a better option than the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. It's just, if you can spend a little bit more to get the 5070, I do think it's worth doing it to get that little additional performance and the NVIDIA feature set at exactly the same VRAM capacity. All right, that's my overall thoughts here. If you want a head-to-head against AMD's lineup, I am planning on doing some head-to-heads against like the 9070, maybe the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte, things like that. And I've been doing some other head-to-head comparisons of these kind of mid-range GPUs as well. So you could look at the channel for those things and stay tuned for more. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day.